From the beginning, we knew that one thing we'd never had on the show was a true medieval pitched battle.
Now, there needs to be a little disclaimer before we even begin. I haven't read the series of novels by J.R.R. Martin, excluding some of the first novel, Game of Thrones itself, but my criticism here is just for the TV show and only for the TV show. It's not about the source material written by the author. Now, having said that, let's begin. I'll begin with saying that this is a thorough critique of all that I found wrong with the so-called Battle of the Bastards. We'll be working our way through the smaller tactical problems that I found in the way the show portrays a medieval-style battle, to the ways the political aspects of the battle and just the episode in general just cease to make any coherent sense at all. And that's really the critical word here. It's coherence, or rather in this case, the complete and utter lack of it. And that's, I think, the reason why so many people have been starting to turn away from Game of Thrones, and if not turn away exactly, then maybe become slightly disinterested. They still follow the show, just like myself, but they just don't feel the same way about the Game of Thrones universe, at least the TV show version of it. It's because, in my opinion, it's lacking in internal consistency. It's stopping to make sense within its own context. So let's start off chronologically, shall we? Taking things from the very beginning of the battle, you see that Ramsay lays out quite an obvious trap, and Jon Snow just obliges him without a second thought. Unlike others, I actually don't think of this as a major flaw with the TV show. I mean, after all, is it really that out of character for Jon to do something so amazingly stupid? In the preceding seasons and episodes, we see that he's a decent and courageous person, but I'm not really sure if he ever displays any particularly intelligent behavior. Mind you, there is a tendency nowadays to confuse bravery with, well, basically, mental retardation, but all things considered, I don't believe Jon Snow charging into Ramsay's obvious trap was egregiously out of character for him. And now we come to the very first peculiar problem with the battle. As Ramsay lets Rickon go, he starts shooting arrows at him. And you see one accurate placed shot go right into the poor fellow's back, dropping him dead. The problem now is that Jon Snow stops just a few feet away from him. Now you have this large immobile target, and what does Ramsay do? Does he take another shot and end the battle right there and then? No. He just hands the bow over to his aide and walks off. There's absolutely no reason for him to do this. Why would he forego a chance to kill the only remaining male heir to the Stark throne? That's the only remaining claimant, yet he lets him go. He doesn't do anything about it. And it doesn't get much better from there on. And I really meant it when I said it just doesn't get better, so I heartily recommend anyone who hasn't seen this and is just watching this, you better brace yourself. Because right after this pass-up by Ramsay, Jon Snow, for unknown reasons, goes full retard and just charges all by his lonesome self into 6,000 men desperate to kill him. Then the entirety of the Bolton archers let loose a volley of arrows. All that happens is that this single man, who is the target of their arrows, he just manages to just ride through it all. Not a single one hits him. Not a single one hits him. Apparently either the writers of the show need to go back to the drawing board, or the Bolton archers need to go to Specsavers. At least the second volley isn't for nothing. This time at least Jon's mount is struck by an arrow or two, and he gets flung from his horse, which is going at full speed, at full gallop, and he throws him. But does his neck break, or does he incur any minor fractures? Nope. This is Jon Snow we're talking about. Even arrows bend to his will, apparently. Next, after this, we have an all too predictable countercharge from the Stark cavalry to save Jon. But what's peculiar is that the wildling infantry charge right from their starting positions, which would actually mean they're well out of breath by the time they come into contact with the enemy right across the field, making them, well, kind of useless. What am I talking about though? This is Game of Thrones, the TV show. Realistic stamina is probably for pussies. Even later on in the battle, arrows rained left and right around Jon, even landing in an extra's face who was just unfortunate enough to wander a little too close to the invisible arrow-deflecting force field that Jon has apparently all around him. This is actually quite a theme in the battle, where both sides charge their men from their starting positions, ensuring that they're all exhausted and out of breath, as well as out of any semblance of a formation by the time they make it to the enemy on the other side of the field. The first cavalry charge ordered by Davos is actually sensible, since it's to save Jon from certain death, which would end the battle right there and then in any case. But the infantry charges are just incomprehensible, especially by the Bolton army, who are in no rush whatsoever. Why on earth should they be the ones running into battle? Tiring themselves out. I mean, how are you going to get all of these men back into formation again when you need that perfect semicircle formed around the Starks? But let's get back to the so-called battle, because at this point it starts to look a lot like the typical rendition of a battle as seen in Hollywood. What I mean by that is the utter lack of any unit cohesion. Hell, there are no units or even bands of friendly soldiers fighting in a loose group. It's just a series of duels, one-on-ones, for our protagonist, Jon in this case, to stumble through. This is actually rather awkward, as the entire battle sequence, it kind of alternates between the classical Hollywood battle, where a battle is just a large mosh pit of chivalrous morons engaged in one-on-one combat, and then the more realistic formation-based scenes where soldiers fight in formations, or at least band together in groups for mutual support, essentially. And there's this thematic dissonance that the movie suffers from. I mean, the episode suffers from. It's kind of schizophrenic. It can't quite decide what it wants to be. And it's actually indicative of just how scatterbrained the writing for this show has become. And you see it in the politics department as well, how the politics and the story unfolds throughout the seasons. What borders on comical, however, is just the ridiculous mountains of dead soldiers and horse carcasses. The creators of the show even had the balls to claim this was inspired by their reading on some historical battles. They even alluded to the Civil War battles, some of which you can see in the background here, where the mounting piles of dead infantry became an obstacle to maneuver. And this is actually true, in that the mounting casualties on a specific piece of terrain would impede any subsequent advance on that land. So this was even the case in a Napoleonic battle going back to 1812 in the Battle of Borodino. The French assault on the Bagration flèches, it couldn't go on as smoothly since there were so many dead piles of soldiers scattered all across the field. However, there were never mountains and heaps and mountain ranges of dead corpses aligned on a single narrow defile, as you see in the TV show. That's ridiculous. What the creators of the show have either completely or willingly misunderstood is that these piles of corpses were an impediment to troops moving in, and this is crucial, battle formation. In the same way, closed order infantry, that's basically to say soldiers in a line shoulder to shoulder, they wouldn't be able to advance in, say, the woods, because you can't advance in the woods shoulder to shoulder whilst maintaining order along the line. You just can't do it. But that doesn't mean that individual soldiers can't move through the woods, and by the same token, it doesn't mean that individual soldiers can't make their way through all the piles of dead soldiers that have been strewn across the battlefield. You rarely get two soldiers on top of one another, let alone these mountains, these gargantuan, ridiculous, preposterous mountains that you see in Game of Thrones, the TV show. I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, if Donald Trump watches this episode, he's likely going to forget all about building a wall on the border and just ask the Game of Thrones TV show to film their next episode on the Mexican border and just don't clean up afterwards. That's going to be his takeaway from this TV show, and you know he would do it. But why would this buffoonery with the mountains of men made out of corpses phenomenon be necessary in the first place? If we need to show that Jon Snow's army has been completely cut off and encircled, then we can do so much better than making up laughable corpse mountain rangers in their back. This diagram here that I drew myself, it shows a realistic version of a double envelopment maneuver which Ramsay's men could have used to encircle Jon Snow's disorganized mob. All you need to do in order to make it a complete encirclement is to show another layer. Basically, instead of 3 layers, you need a 4th layer, like this. And there you go. Complete encirclement without the need to resort to some laughable mountain of corpses, cutting them off from the rear. I mean, was that so bloody hard to do? Wasn't the point of this entire episode and this entire battle sequence to portray what a true medieval pitched battle would be like? Would it be so hard to keep to actual, realistic formations for the battle? Is that too much to ask? But there's something else, even more immersion breaking, in the way that the Stark army is surrounded, and that's the ease with which they're surrounded. It's as if there's a truce or some kind of agreed upon lull in the fighting as the pikemen of House Umber just casually stride by the Stark army to form this perfect horseshoe around them. All that was needed to disrupt that maneuver would have been if Jon Snow and his men closed with the pikemen and completely disrupted their deployment into a semicircle. But that would have been inconvenient for the narrative, so instead we have Jon and his men stand back and look on goofily as their enemy just waltzes around them as if the Stark army has all of a sudden become collectively brain dead. Just look at them. I said I would have some issues with the way the battle unfolded tactically, and this is where the problem is most discernible. A believable way of making the encirclement happen would have been if the Umber pikemen had been subdivided. This way, I mean, the first line could have just engaged the Stark army frontally, fixing their focus there, whilst the second and third lines could have used this to flank around on either side, and basically make a cauldron, as you see there. And finally, a 4th line, just to make the box complete and complete the encirclement, the 4th line could have replaced that ridiculous, comical mountain of dead men. For a historical example, just take a look at the Battle of Cannae, which the creators themselves in making episode 9 alluded to. Now, the Battle of Cannae was where the Carthaginian general Hannibal fixed the Romans' attention frontally and pulled them into his center. After that had fixed the Romans in the position he wanted, he used the African reserve infantry on either of his flanks to spring his trap. The Carthaginian cavalry then returned and sealed the pockets, and that's how he completed the encirclement. Notice how the Carthaginians didn't just stroll up to the Romans and just trot around their flanks, with the Romans staying put like a bunch of cretinous imbeciles, allowing themselves to get surrounded without any resistance or any reaction. And please, just please don't give me that shit about them being tired or exhausted. They do plenty of strenuous activity even after they are broken free from that predicament that they're in. In fact, all the way up to storming the castle of Winterfell, no siege required. Just a simple advance and closing with the enemy with the pikemen would have been sufficient to interrupt that deployment, because they were just walking around. How easy would it have been, just through advance and contact, to halt that deployment? But instead, we see a comatose army with zero reaction. But oh well, the narrative requires it, so fuck it, why not? This is Game of Thrones after all, the TV show. This brings me to the most unforgivable moments of the battle. The arrival of Littlefinger's Army of the Vale in tandem with Sansa Stark wearing a stupid smirk on her face as if to taunt the audience in how nonsensical the plot can get. How on earth is this possible? How could Ramsay be taken by surprise so deep in his own territory? How the fuck did this giant cavalry army teleport to this location in time? As far as I'm aware, Ramsay is still Lord of the North, a realm which begins at a place called the Neck, much further south to Winterfell, and the army of the Vale is quite a long distance to the southeast, if I'm not mistaken. It's well beyond that chokehold, the Neck, and it's actually separated by numerous other obstacles. I think it's called the Riverlands or something like that. At least this was my impression from the TV show so far, and what limited sense of geography and location I had gained throughout the seasons, given the occasional maps that they showed us here and there. But I had to double check to make sure I wasn't being a fool or wasn't gravely mistaken. As it turns out, I wasn't a fool, nor was I mistaken. In fact, I'm quite self-righteously vindicated in saying that, yeah, the Vale is quite a fucking distance away from the Neck over here, and that's the Vale, that's the Eyrie, the heart of the Vale. And as you can see, it's quite a long march all the way up to Winterfell, where the battle actually takes place. But we know the Vale army couldn't have been in the north, since Ramsay would have long heard about an encroaching army from the south, but evidently not. As you see, he looks terribly surprised by Littlefinger's cavalry army swooping down on his men. Is it possible that Sansa overnight met up with Littlefinger and force-marched an entire army over such a vast distance? Let's just consider the geography in detail. Forget the intuitive sense of distance the TV show has kind of maintained up to, well, recently. We can already see that going from the Vale, here coloured in dark blue, to the north is already restricted by the sea to the immediate north, and what I presume is neutral territory to the northwest. I'm guessing that's the Riverlands. But let's get just slightly more detailed here. And to do that, just look at this map. Here we have the Vale, engulfed in a very obvious series of mountain ranges. It's not exactly the most traversable terrain you could think of. But let's be generous. Let's be as generous as we can. Let's imagine that the army of Littlefinger that Sansa basically brought back to Winterfell to basically win the battle is encamped somewhere at the very edge of the Vale. So beyond all this very rugged terrain and on the border with the north, in fact. So let's just imagine that. It has to still go through the north and then half of the north towards Winterfell. So let's just find out about what kind of a place this Neck is of Moat Cailin. What kind of terrain does it have? Is it traversable? And I found a quote, don't take my word for it, a quote from the books themselves. Our land protects its own. An outsider will find in the Neck an endless morass of suckholes, quicksands, and green grass that looks solid to the unweary eye, but turns to water the instant you tread it. Mirror Reed. And even after that, after you pass Moat Cailin, somehow, I don't know how, you pass Moat Cailin, you still have to keep on going and traverse half the length and breadth of the north to get to Winterfell. So basically you have to keep on going right past these mountains, in between these two mountain ranges, past that ravine, past the castle of Cerwyn. Apparently all these fortifications do not slow an army down. They just wave happily by at you as you go past. And Ramsay doesn't have any communication with his subalterns, his lords, his underlings, nor does he have spies within his own realm. He has no idea what's going on in his own realm. And this army of the Vale is cutting through this terrain like knife through butter. And it's going basically cross-country like a Panzer Mark III going across the Russian plains. Nothing can stop it. Let's forget about how preposterous the miraculous arrival of the army of the Vale is. Just think about what Sansa's role is in all of this. She couldn't tell Jon that there might be a massive army less than a night's march away coming to their aid, so he could alter his plans accordingly. There's a scene where they're talking explicitly about what they should do the next morning, and all she can muster is, "Don't know, Jon. Just don't do what Ramsay wants you to do." Oh, fuck my life. That's incredible advice right there. Watch out. Here comes the next Catherine the Great. What possible motive could she have of keeping this crucial information from him? Doesn't she trust him? Now, that would be out of character. But even if we grant that all the shit she's been through has led her to distrust even Jon, it still doesn't make sense in terms of her own self-interest to keep this vital information from Jon. It's crucial information for both him and her. So why do we have this incoherent scene with Sansa bringing the army of the Vale to rescue Jon? I actually think the answer is quite obvious. The creators of the show felt they needed to portray Sansa as the savior and feed into a narrative of a girl becoming a grown woman who can now not only take care of herself, but save her brother as well as his men. It's her who truly takes back Winterfell, not Jon, who would have been nothing more than another brick in a human corpse wall stretching to the sky. The problem is, however, that the internal consistency and logic of the world is shattered, and the coherence of the narrative is severely damaged by all the forced happenstances which need to take place in order to fulfill this part in Sansa's very artificial character development by the authors. I mean, the writers, what a cheesy arrival it is, Sansa's arrival over the hill. I mean, Lord of the Rings did it much more tastefully and coherently than this, but even then it was a tad bit on the cheesy side. Cavalry riding over the horizon just in time to save the day. Oh, Game of Thrones, how the mighty have fallen. There are, however, a number of fans who have attempted to explain this away, and most of them are, well, desperate and pathetic attempts at rationalization for just plainly weak writing on behalf of the creators of the show. I'm not surprised. I mean, after all, a lot of people have come to expect the complexity and depth, which is apparently a hallmark of the books by J.R.R. Martin. And it's no surprise people are in denial. I mean, I sympathize to an extent. One of the more competently argued cases, however, for at least the appearance of some coherence in the narrative, comes from a fellow from another YouTuber, with the username King Mackay. And I've linked his channel in the description. I think his video is worth checking out. The following is more or less the summary of King May's theory on why, as he views it, Sansa betrayed Jon. And I'll let him speak for himself.
She decided not to tell Jon about the Vale army, not to give him the information he needed to be able to fight a battle that he desperately did everything he could to be able to win. Instead, she held back and said, "No, let's just use Jon's army as bait to draw Ramsay out of Winterfell so the Vales can just clean up after half his army's been slaughtered to death, and he and Rickon could have possibly both died, just Rickon ended up dying, and then she would claim Winterfell with the support of Peter Baelish." So with Sansa's hindsight of her knowing about the Vale, Jon's army, and Ramsay's character, she made a decision between two things. One, she could trust Jon, she could trust him and his ability to be able to lead and to be able to keep level-headed and take out Ramsay the way that they best could, by exposing the Vale army, working together, coordinating with them, meeting up with them, coming in, doing either a siege, which might not actually work that well, or negotiations with Ramsay, which is the better option, to be able to get Rickon back, to be able to win and get everything over with, but she would kind of lose her revenge, and she wouldn't be able to have a certain path to victory. Also, with that scenario, she didn't really understand or completely have enough experience with Jon to be able to put that in, and when we saw the actual battle, we also saw that his level-headedness in the battle could have been a downside as well. Or she could do another option, which is not to tell Jon about the Vale, to be able to meet up with Peter Baelish beforehand in the battle, sit up on a hill, watch everything happen, watch Jon overcommit and get manipulated by Ramsay, even though she didn't want that to fully happen. I can't blame that on her. She warned him about Ramsay and he failed in that aspect, but still his army was pulled into a terrible trap, surrounded, and they were all going to get slaughtered. Half of them died anyway, doesn't even matter, and that just put Peter Baelish in the perfect scenario to sweep in, take out all those troops, take out Ramsay, and get Winterfell with a clean path to victory. She lost Ramsay, she lost Jon's army and possibly could have lost Jon as well, but she chose to make that clear, revengeful, and path to victory over trusting in her family and her brothers.
But the problem with this supposed plan of Sansa's is that it doesn't give Sansa anything other than almost certainly getting her brother killed along with the only real Stark army under his command. To say nothing about the fact that the best case scenario, even if the plan succeeds, would be Littlefinger's only remaining army would be the Arbiter of the North, and they, indebted to him for giving them victory over Ramsay, would become his vassals. So they would guarantee that Littlefinger became de facto Lord of the North. Besides, how does this mean she would get her revenge? I don't understand that part. As if she wouldn't get her revenge if she and her brother used their own army in conjunction with Littlefinger's forces to overcome Ramsay? How does that make sense? They would let him go if they won with their own army intact or something? Sansa's revenge on Ramsay was in no way, shape or form predicated on how victory over him was to be achieved. Another point I would like to make is that why would Sansa trust Littlefinger over her own brother, especially after telling Littlefinger to go fuck himself in episode 5, which is actually the last of us seeing him. We never saw him again after that point up to now. Again, we see that even in the more carefully thought out attempts to explain away the problems inherent in the writing of this episode, and widely in this season, we are still required to construct wildly inconsistent characters in inconceivable circumstances. If this indeed is an attempt by the screenplay writers to add a sinister turn to Sansa's character development, then it's terribly forced. The result is Sansa's character being portrayed as masterfully manipulative and dastardly clever in pursuing her own self-interest, whilst the viewer who pays just enough attention realizes all too easily that none of her actions are either clever or in Sansa's own self-interest. Incongruence permeates throughout the plotline and is present at every turn and twist. I mean, what possible harm could come of Jon knowing of Littlefinger's cavalry army's arrival? How does that endanger Sansa's interests in the slightest? You see, the thing is, you don't trust a person with information that can do possible harm to you or your position, but how could there be any possibility of harm to Sansa or her position by Jon knowing about the presence of an army under Littlefinger? Sansa has everything to gain and nothing to lose by sharing this information, regardless of whether there is trust between them or not. Besides which, all of this is unimportant, as we've already established that Littlefinger's army being anywhere near Winterfell without Ramsay knowing well in advance is so preposterous as to defy all credulity. The real reason for this entire sequence, this entire episode, this incongruous mess, was so that Sansa could come to the rescue of her brother in a terribly forced and contrived scene in order to showcase to the audience that she has truly come of age and is no longer in need of Jon Snow's or anyone else's protection for that matter. The show just sacrificed its coherence and internal logic in order to force a scenario in which Sansa could have a heroic moment of her own, and idiots like this reviewer that I'm about to show you right now can have an emotional, teary-eyed experience from what is essentially an idiotically contrived storyline. So let's go to that reviewer and let me show you why the masses, the plebs, eat this garbage up.
I didn't think that Jon Snow was going to lose at any point throughout this episode. I was like watching this alone in my living room, and the Army of the Vale showed up with Sansa just like looking like a total boss, and I just started crying. Like, there are so few moments where something good happens in a great way, and like that was just such a triumphant moment that I don't know, it just like, it really moved me, and I was like, I'm a fucking sap. Like, pardon my bleep, but like that's how.
Yeah, that's how we know there is no hope for this generation. I mean, the only impact felt by viewers with even the most meager of intellects was a complete and utter collapse in their immersion. We're no longer following the story of a dispossessed Stark clan desperately and triumphantly retaking their stronghold, but instead we're witnessing the desperate and hopelessly clumsy attempts of the screenplay writers to force these characters, both mentally and geographically, into positions which they cannot be. The show has become incoherent. I mean, why does Ramsay shoot an arrow into the giant's skull when Jon is right there beside him? Why? He could have ended Jon Snow with that very shot, but no. Instead, the TV show pathetically attempts to emotionally manipulate us by forcing yet another scene in which the characters act inexplicably well out of character. Instead of Ramsay ending Jon Snow, the leader of the Stark army, with one ruthless shot, we are treated to this phony scene in which he slays the beloved giant, presumably to make us, the audience, despise him even more, and to justify his later gruesome death, I'm assuming. Yet another happenstance which sacrifices the internal coherence of the narrative for cheap attempts to emotionally manipulate the audience. This kind of storytelling is evidently, however, quite effective. Just look at all the praise heaped on this garbage episode, which has apparently also been nominated for a handful of Emmy Awards. To say nothing of the plebs who were affected emotionally by this garbage because they're so lacking in intellect that the glaring incoherencies of what has just happened just don't seem to penetrate into their thick skulls. I think this last episode has been the last straw that broke the camel's back. I don't think I'm going to be watching Game of Thrones anymore. I think I'm going to do myself a good one here, a solid, and I'm just going to transition to the books, because from what I hear, these glaring inconsistencies and just irrational plot points, they're absent from the books, the original material. So I would actually recommend you do the same and transition away from this regurgitated, mainstream, streamlined bullshit. Anyway, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this rant, and go ahead and subscribe if you've enjoyed this and you're looking forward to more. Take care.